Okay, welcome back. This is probably our last lecture for Unit 3. So when we last left off, we were talking about what is or isn't a representation. And one of the points that I would like to make is that representation can happen even when the artist isn't intending it. So here's a good example of a painting that's white square on white, and or I think the actual title, Suprematist Composition, white on white, but it's often known simply as white square. And it's a beautiful painting. I love the color contrast because the two whites are very, are just that really subtle difference of color between them. And but even though it's a painting with almost nothing in it, and yet when people go to see it, people feel like it's a painting of something. People feel like it's a painting where something's going to happen. People look at this painting and feel like that square is in some sort of action. It's about to move somewhere. Another example of the same kind of idea would be Philip Guston, where for a period he tried very hard to make paintings that were nothing other than just paintings about mark making. But he came to realize that no matter how hard he tried, every painting was an image. Every painting was a something that people were going to read into it in some way, that there is no avoidance of that. So what is real? What is a real representation? Here's a painting by Magritte, right? And the title of the painting, The Treachery of Images, tells you exactly what he's trying to say, which is that representation is not real. Representation inherently is unreal. And that is true. All representation is a lie. And also, all representation is biased. All representation has ideals that it's aiming for. And so oftentimes when we see works of art, like let's say the Venus of Willendorf here, otherwise known as Fertility figurine, when we see a piece like this and it seems so hard to understand why it looks the way it does, right? It seems so strange and so unreal, so unnaturalistic. And the thing to remember is that it is the way it is because of the ideals of the culture that produced it. So it is a representation of the things that they thought were important. But images can be unreal, and so it's an important thing to remember in this class that we tend to want to think that something like this is straightforward, but it's not straightforward. This is not a painting of a lady looking away, right? This is a painting of a photograph. This is a photograph, but it's not a real photograph of Cindy Sherman. Cindy Sherman has set this photograph up to look like it's happening in the mid-60s. She's wearing a costume. She's wearing makeup. She's chosen buildings specifically to represent a kind of a particular time period and a very specific angle, and she's edited out everything that would alter that kind of perception. But this photograph was not taken in this era. It was taken in 1978. And this painting also is not really wholly real. It is a simplification. It is an abstraction. In a way, this is just as idealized, simplified, abstracted as that Cycladic piece we saw right at the beginning. Let's go back just for a second. Let's look at that comparison. This one right here. See what I mean? They're both about paring things down, simplifying, right? Making decisions about what are the essential things you want to say about head, or the essential things you want to say about expression. So what is truthful, and what, truthful to which part? Here's a good example of a work of art that seems pretty honest and is completely dishonest in some ways. In this piece, Sunflower Seeds, Ai Weiwei fills large rooms, sometimes rooms as large as a football field, full 1 foot, 2 foot, filled up to with sunflower seeds. But when you actually examine the sunflower seeds, you realize they're not real sunflower seeds. Each one is a handmade work of ceramics. Each one is handmade and hand painted. In fact, he actually hired an entire village in China to work for a number of years just making these sunflower seeds. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that once you kind of learn to accept the fact that all representation is biased, all representation has a point of view, that there really is no such thing as purely naturalistic representation or purely real representation, then you start to realize that it's the deviation from reality and the deviation from optical reality. Those two things are not the same, by the way, right? Like how we see the world and the way the world is are themselves not actually the same thing. But anyway, how the deviations from those things are often the things that make the artwork interesting. When you first see a painting like this, the thing that's overwhelming is the seemingly how real it is to you, how she seems so very much there. But the more you examine it, it's the stylization. It's the style choices, how he has simplified this contour and stylized, made the line of this contour extra elegant, right, is part of the point of the work, and it's what makes the work interesting. So is this unrealistic or is this realistic? You know, when you first see a painting like this, it seems crude and maybe amateurish, but maybe it's not. So let's get back to the Greeks just for a second. I have one little story to tell about how the Greeks, like I said, they really saw making sculpture as being about creating the ideal, not about representation, and definitely not about like a naturalism, like the type of naturalism that you would see in a portrait. In fact, actually, portraiture was frowned upon in Greek art, especially any kind of Greek art that was made for temples, which was most Greek art, right? Most Greek art was made for religious purposes. But there's a famous story that there was a court case, and people took Pericles, and they took Phidias to court because someone had noticed that in one of the sculptures on the inside of, like the inside upper wall, there was a frieze sculpture where there appeared to be some people who were clearly recognizable, one of them clearly being Phidias. And this was considered a horrific act of heresy, to put your own actual portrait on something as important and as pious and as religious as the Temple of Athena. So he was brought to trial for this. The Romans, on the other hand, especially at the beginning, were not so terrified of portraiture. They had a tradition in their culture of making death masks, where the family members, when they died, they would make a wax mask of each family member, and then from those wax masks they would make these plaster busts to keep a record of, you know, basically like a family photograph of all their deceased relatives. And it was an important part of their ritual to bring those busts out on certain holidays to celebrate their deceased ancestors. So the Romans were much more comfortable with portraiture, but even still, when we look at official Roman art, right, this portrait of Commodus doesn't really look like Commodus at all. It looks much more like Greek and Roman sculptures of Heracles or Hercules than it does of Commodus himself. It is an idealized portrait. So the important sculptures, the official sculptures, the non-family sculptures, became more and more idealized in the same way that Greek sculpture was about ideal rather than naturalism or reality. And it wasn't really until the end of the Gothic period and the beginning of the Renaissance that we start to see in Western art artists who are actually interested in portraiture and self-portraiture. And here we have three examples of artists whom, this one we're not sure whether this painting by Robert Campin is a self-portrait or not, but it quite possibly is. So three examples of self-portraits and a possible self-portrait. And the point I just want you to see is that the looking at oneself, the intensity of that, but also remember that even here, the sense that we're actually seeing a person, we're seeing a real individuality, this is more illusion than it is reality. Just like